Hi there. This is Molendinarius here, Evan from the LATINUM Institute. And today I want to talk to you about a book called the Robertsonian Method. Now, the Robertsonian method is an 18th century conversational method for learning Latin. And I stumbled across this book by it's not actually by Robertson. It's by Alexandre Monteith and published in 1845 in the Latin version. What this is a very interesting textbook. It's a development of a much earlier Latin methodology called the Jacotot method, designed for teaching French as a living contemporary modern language, in other words, natural language. And then it was adapted for Latin, but interestingly enough, while keeping the modern language teaching methodology by Alexandre Monteith. Monteith authored versions in French, Spanish, German, Italian. I'm not sure if he wrote them himself or if he paid somebody to make the translations for him and then published them, but they were published under his name. And furthermore, he was the author of an English version of Arndt's Latin and Greek textbooks, and these books were originally published in German. And also he published an English version of Arndt's Italian textbook. I'm not sure if he did this with the other languages, the modern language of Spanish, German, French. I'm not certain about that. The textbook itself has a very interesting structure. It starts by offering a short prose passage in Latin, which is then analyzed in very great detail. And it's followed by a natural language question-answer sequence, which is based on the text in the form of a dialogue. And the method works as follows. The text is given along with an interlinear translation. A pronunciation guide is provided, but this is of antiquarian interest only, as it provides the pronunciation scheme for Latin as Latin was spoken in England in the 1840s. And this marks the very last time, really, that Latin in the Old English pronunciation still held sway, because starting from the mid-1800s until the end of 1800s, certainly pushing up towards the First World War, the Association for the Reform of Latin Teaching virulently opposed the traditional native pronunciation of Latin, to the extent that this pronunciation is now extinct. I'll read some for you and you'll see how it goes. It's quite hard for me. I've got to think quite hard. Viatores trace in itinerary thesaurum invenerunt, atque inter se dixerunt, esuraimus necessi est unum ex nobis discederi, et quae victum necessaria sint emeri. Ex his unus hac menti discessit, caebumque paravit. So that's more or less how Latin was spoken in Cambridge and Oxford and throughout English from the time of Henry VIII. Queen Elizabeth I would have spoken Latin somewhat like that. Henry VIII, Thomas More, all of the scholars that spoke Latin in England right until the 1850s. I think there's now only one teacher left at Winchester College who still sticks to this pronunciation method. So Viatores trace in itinerary thesaurum invenerunt, atque inter se dixerunt, esuraimus necesse est unum ex nobis discederi, et quae ad victum necessaria sint emeri. Ex his unus hac menti discessit. I'm not sure if it's going to be cibumque or tribumque paravit, probably cibumque. So that's how it would have been. Anyway, we're going to ignore that completely. And if you want to sound like an antiquarian speaking Latin as it was spoke, have a look at this textbook, because he goes through the traditional pronunciation in quite some detail, giving pointers on how to go about pronouncing it that way. Anyway, so that's the extinct native English pronunciation of Latin, as used in England for centuries, until superseded by the restored classical pronunciation in the 1900s. And that then kicked out the traditional English pronunciation, to the extent that people have forgotten it ever existed, unless they're saying things like cacti and miser, and so on. These words, the Latin word miser would have been pronounced miser. So the text gives a short prose story, and then this text is provided in 2 columns, and the students asked to engage in double translation from Latin to English and English to Latin, backwards and forwards, until they can translate the text, covering up one side and going to the other, backwards and forwards. Page 5 begins a section which would have been highly controversial in 1845. In fact, it's still controversial today. Latin conversation. In 1745, this would not have seemed out of place, as until the mid-1700s, Latin was still in regular use throughout Europe in universities. It was the very tail end of that. The jingoism that accompanied nationalism and the rise of the nation state had not yet pushed the internationalist, open-minded Latin into the dustbin of history, replacing it by the individual languages of the nation state. And of course, now English is performing the role that was previously performed by Latin. Monteith writes, Latin cannot in the present day be deemed a colloquial language. And then he continues and says, but an exercise in conversation may nevertheless serve a variety of useful purposes. Now, what are these purposes? Monteith enumerates them as follows: impressing words already known upon the memory. And this is key. This is something that modern language theorists talk about a great deal, that if language is learned in context, then of course it's better for you than if you're just learning lists of words and abstract grammar. Vocabulary in context is much better learned than vocabulary learned from a list. Words in a question-answer sequence can be presented in various aspects and various combinations, therefore expanding your knowledge of Latin construction. And also it illustrates the use of language in practice. So here's an example of a scripted conversation. No translation is provided because by this stage in the textbook, page 5, the student will have encountered all the vocabulary used while studying the short text, upon which the comprehension questions based on this very short text are based. So, for example, the question will be, quis thesaurum invenit? And quidam viatores, quod viatores tres, quid invenerunt thesaurum quendam, and so on, until the full context of the short text that has been learned has been covered in detail. Now, in terms of where this fits in with the LATINUM Institute, I think this text is an excellent adjunct to Adler's practical grammar of the Latin language, and it addresses a deficiency in Adler, namely the lack of long pieces of continuous prose under analysis. And in the LATINUM Institute's course that's provided at Patreon in audio, much other material is provided in audio to sort of fill out this deficiency that exists in Adler, using Comenius and other authors, Aesop's Fables, and so on and so on. But Robertson's method is the most closely aligned to Adler's method and is highly complementary with it. Monteith, later on in the book, also gives guidelines for construction, in other words, Latin composition. This is a neglected area in modern Latin courses, and these are largely translation-only courses. Very, very few modern Latin courses require the student to write anything in Latin that is not actual reverse translation, and even that is something that's hardly ever done, simply because there are very few Latin teachers who have the tools to correct a student's composition in Latin. It's one thing to correct a translation from Latin to English. It's another thing to correct a student's work from English to Latin or free composition in Latin. That puts a large burden on the Latin teacher and presumes that the Latin teacher actually knows Latin quite well. So, as Monteith points out, if you want to become good at writing Latin, then there's no better teacher than immersing yourself in the language itself, in the classical authors, and in various texts that were written to help a student reach that level of fluency, particularly the texts that are promoted and turned into audio materials at the LATINUM Institute, texts that were used during the Renaissance when Latin was still a workhorse language. So that is that's the Latin method of Monteith based on Robertson, and you can find out more about it at latinum.org.uk. Vale. Goodbye.